Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're tackling something that I think a lot of us struggle with, emotional eating. We're going way beyond just like eat your feelings kind of stuff. We're really going to dig into the science here. And to help us do that, we're diving into this awesome ebook called Mindful Eating and Nutrition: Overcoming Emotional Eating. It's by Dr. Heike Franz. And, her story is really interesting. She actually spent some time in the ICU as a teenager because of anorexia. And she's super open about her struggles throughout her life in this book, which makes it really relatable.
Yeah, it's really cool how she combines like her personal story with some pretty solid scientific stuff. It's a hard balance to strike
Yeah.
sometimes,
Yeah.
but she does it really well. It's relatable, but it's also very credible.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just dive right in. I think we've all been there, right? Like a super stressful day at work or, a bad breakup. And suddenly you find yourself staring into the freezer at like a pint of ice cream. But what's actually happening in our brains when we like reach for that comfort food instead of, I don't know, a carrot?
Right, it's not just a matter of willpower. There's actually a system called your HPA axis, and this basically controls your stress response. So like when it gets triggered, your body pumps out cortisol. You short bursts of cortisol are totally fine. But when you're chronically stressed, it can really mess with your HPA axis. And that can make you way more vulnerable to emotional eating.
So it's almost like our body gets stuck in like fight or flight mode, even if there's not a real threat. Like the threat is just like a deadline at work or, an argument with a friend or something.
Yeah, exactly. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Cortisol doesn't just increase your appetite in general. It actually like targets specific regions in your brain,
Hmm.
like your amygdala and hippocampus, which are involved with like processing emotions and memory. So you're not just hungry, you're like craving those specific foods that you associate with pleasure and comfort. It's a really powerful biological drive.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Like I can resist the donuts in the break room all week, but then after a stressful meeting, suddenly I'm like, oh my God, I need a donut.
Right. And it's not that you certainly have zero willpower. It's like your brain chemistry is literally pushing you toward those high calorie, high reward foods.
Okay, so we're not just like weak or whatever. There's an actual like scientific reason for this. But what about the long term? Like, does being stressed all the time just mean we're destined to emotionally eat forever?
Not necessarily. But understanding the connection is definitely the first step. And Dr. Franz even talks about how menopause can make all of this even worse. So as estrogen declines, your body's ability to produce cortisol actually goes up. So women going through menopause might experience even more intense cravings and emotional eating.
Wow, that's actually really helpful for a lot of women to know. Because then they can like approach those cravings with a little more compassion for themselves, right?
Yeah.
It's not like a personal feeling, it's like literally a hormonal thing.
Right, exactly. Knowledge is power. And once you understand the triggers, you can start to break the cycle. Dr. Franz actually lists a bunch of common triggers like stress, boredom, loneliness, and even positive emotions. Like sometimes even being really excited about something can be a trigger.
That's so true. Like, I know I'm guilty of that. Like, even just having a celebratory glass of wine or whatever can lead to me wanting to snack later on.
Uh-huh.
But okay, so it's not enough to just know the triggers. We have to actually do something about them.
Absolutely. And that's where mindful eating comes in.
Hmm.
This isn't just some like trendy term. It's a really powerful tool based in neuroscience. It actually takes about 20 minutes for your brain to register fullness signals from your stomach. And mindful eating helps to bridge that gap.
Oh, so like if we're just scarfing down food, our brains don't even have time to tell us that we're full. And that leads to overeating.
Exactly. Mindful eating kind of forces you to slow down and engage all of your senses and really savor each bite. Dr. France has this great example in the book where she describes eating a strawberry. You're paying attention to like the texture and the aroma and how sweet it is.
I love that visual. It makes me realize how often I just like shovel food into my face without even thinking about it, especially when I'm stressed or working.
And that's a huge part of the problem. You're not connecting with the food at all. You're just using it to like numb out or distract yourself. Mindful eating is all about bringing your attention back to the experience.
Okay, so mindful eating is key. But what about the food itself? Does it matter what we eat? Or is it more about like how we eat?
Well, both are important. Dr. Franz really stresses that nutrition is a key part of managing emotional eating. And it's not about like restrictive dieting or anything. It's more about nourishing your body with like a balanced macro mix of protein, complex carbs, and healthy fats.
I've heard that term macro mix before, but I don't know if I totally get it. Can you break that down for us? Like, is there a magic formula or something?
Well, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. But Dr. Franz is really good at explaining like the why behind the what. So protein helps you feel full for longer, complex carbs give you sustained energy, and healthy fats are super important for hormone balance and brain function. She actually talks about her own journey of finding her ideal macro mix, and she says it takes some experimentation.
So it's more about listening to your body and finding what works for you. And it's not about depriving yourself, it's about making choices that support, your overall well-being.
Exactly. It's about fueling your body and your mind with the nutrients they need to function at their best, both physically and emotionally.
And speaking of fuel, I was really surprised by how much Dr. Franz talks about hydration. We all know we should drink more water, but she explains how dehydration can actually mimic hunger cues. And it can mess with your mood, too.
Yeah, it makes sense when you think about it. Like our bodies are mostly water, and if we're dehydrated, our brains can't function properly. So that leads to fatigue and brain fog and even like increased cravings.
This is a good question for our listeners. How often do you think you reach for a snack when you're actually just thirsty? I know I'm guilty of that all the time.
It's a super common mistake. A simple tip is to keep a water bottle with you all day and just sip on it regularly. You can even set reminders on your phone if you need to.
Yeah, that's a great tip. So before we move on to the next part of this deep dive, let's just do a quick recap of what we've learned so far. Emotional eating is actually rooted in our biology, but we can totally break the cycle. Understanding our triggers, practicing mindful eating, and choosing nourishing foods are all really key.
Yeah, and remember, this is a journey, not a quick fix. In the next part, we're going to explore some more practical strategies from the book for actually making lasting changes. So stay tuned.
Okay, so we're back. And now I want to get into the nitty-gritty, how do we actually make some lasting changes when it comes to emotional eating?
Yeah, that's the real question, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Dr. Friends actually lays out some really solid strategies in her book. One of the first things she talks about is self-monitoring.
Self-monitoring. So spying on ourselves, basically.
Haha, kind of. But it's not about judging yourself or anything. It's about becoming aware. You're basically a detective of your own habits. So you track your eating patterns, your emotions, and the situations that make you want to reach for that comfort food. You can use a journal or an app, whatever works for you.
Yeah, it's like shining a light on those unconscious patterns, right? Like all those times where we're on autopilot and we just end up with a bag of chips in our hand.
Exactly. And once you have that awareness, you can actually start making different choices. Dr. Friends also talks about doing regular check-ins.
Like scheduling a time to just kind of reflect on how we're doing.
Yeah, exactly. It could be
Fun.
daily, weekly, whatever works for you.
Okay.
It's just about taking a step back, acknowledging your successes,
Mhm.
seeing what challenges came up, and then adjusting your plan if you need to.
Oh, so it's like having a built-in accountability system. But what about when we mess up? What if we have a day where we totally cave and eat all the things?
Well, that's going to happen. And Dr. Friends is really open about that. She even has a whole section of the book about dealing with setbacks. She uses this great analogy about learning to walk. We all fell down a million times before we finally got it right.
Oh, I love that. It takes the pressure off a little bit, right? It's like setbacks aren't failures, they're just part of the process.
Exactly. And instead of beating yourself up about it, look at those setbacks as opportunities to learn. Ask yourself, okay, what happened there? What triggered me? How can I handle it differently next time?
It's about being curious instead of critical. I love that. Dr. Friends actually shares her own story about trying to quit smoking. And she says she had a bunch of setbacks before she finally kicked the habit for good.
Yeah, and her being so vulnerable about it is really inspiring because it shows us that even the experts struggle with this stuff.
Yeah.
And that change isn't always linear.
So true. Okay, so we need to be kind to ourselves. View setbacks as opportunities to learn and celebrate those little victories. But what about external stuff? Does our environment play a role in emotional eating too?
Oh, absolutely. Dr. Friend says that having a supportive environment is crucial. So surround yourself with people who encourage healthy habits, not people who tempt you with the unhealthy stuff.
Right, it's about creating a space where you feel good about making healthy choices.
Exactly. And sometimes that means setting boundaries with certain people, or maybe avoiding situations that trigger you to overeat, or even just making sure your house is stocked with healthy foods.
Yeah, being prepared is key. And the book also talks about having a relapse prevention plan. Can you tell me a little more about that? What does that actually look like?
It's basically like a roadmap for how to navigate those moments when you feel tempted to fall back into old habits. So it involves anticipating your triggers and coming up with a plan for how to deal with them effectively.
So, if I know that I always crave ice cream after a fight with my partner, I might make a plan to call a friend instead or go for a walk or something, something to process my emotions that doesn't involve food.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about having a whole toolbox of strategies you can use. Like you can do mindfulness exercises or go for a run or write in a journal. Or sometimes even just taking a few deep breaths can help.
The key is to be prepared, right?
Hmm.
To have a plan in place before you're in the middle of a craving.
Yeah, exactly. And don't forget, you can always ask for help. It's okay to reach out to a therapist or a dietitian or even a support group if you need more support.
Absolutely. And Dr. Franz is really big on self-compassion too, especially when we're dealing with those inevitable slip-ups. It's so easy to beat ourselves up, but that just makes things worse.
Oh, yeah. Self-compassion is so important. It's about recognizing that we're all human and
Yeah.
we're all going to make mistakes. It's not about letting yourself off the hook. It's about treating yourself with the same kindness you would offer a friend.
I love that. It's about acknowledging the mistake without judging yourself and then getting back on track.
Right. And don't forget to celebrate those victories. No matter how small they are, each step forward is a win.
Yeah, it's those little victories that keep us going right. We have to focus on the progress, not just the end goal.
Exactly. And speaking of the bigger picture, I think it's time to wrap up part 2 of our deep dive. When we come back, we'll talk about the key takeaways from Dr. Franz's book, and we'll leave our listeners with some final words of encouragement. So stay with us.
Welcome back to this deep dive. It's been pretty eye-opening exploring emotional eating with Dr. Franz's book. What really stuck out to you during this whole conversation?
I think for me, the biggest thing is how Dr. Franz's changes the way we think about emotional eating. It's not like this big shameful secret or anything. It's more like just a normal physiological response to stress.
Yeah.
And it's also a way of trying to meet like our emotional needs.
Yeah, that's a really different way of looking at it, for sure. So instead of beating ourselves up for wanting that comfort food,
Right.
we can look at it as like a sign that something else is going on.
Right. And the book gives us the tools to actually understand those signals. And, we can make different choices, like learning about the HPA axis and how cortisol affects the brain, and even how menopause plays a role. It's all really helpful.
It's like it takes away the guilt and shame
Yeah.
and gives us back our power. Like we're not just victims of our biology. We can actually make changes once we understand what's happening.
Yeah. And it's not about being perfect either. Dr. Franz is all about progress, not perfection. She knows that setbacks are going to happen. And she actually encourages us to see them as opportunities to learn and grow.
I love that she normalizes that whole part of the process. Like nobody's perfect. And she even talks about her own struggles with quitting smoking. It shows that everyone goes through this stuff.
Yeah, it makes it all feel way more relatable for sure.
Definitely. So we've talked about a lot of great strategies like mindful eating and having a good support system, and even making a plan for when you're tempted to relapse. If someone's feeling a little overwhelmed by all this info, where would you recommend they start?
Honestly, I'd say just start with noticing what's going on. Like grab a notebook or something and just track your patterns. Like
Yeah.
when do you crave those comfort foods? How are you feeling? What's going on around you? Just that simple act of paying attention can be so powerful.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to start small. Like maybe you swap out a sugary snack for a piece of fruit, or you try eating one meal a day more mindfully, like actually slowing down and savoring it.
Yeah, those little things add up. And when you start to see yourself making those changes, it gives you more confidence to keep going.
Dr. Franz talks a lot about celebrating those small victories, and I think that's so important. It's a way to find joy in the journey and appreciate all the progress you're making.
It's a total mindset shift. Instead of focusing on what you're restricting yourself from, you're focusing on taking care of yourself and giving your body what it really needs.
I love that. So before we wrap up this whole deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. Dr. Franz talks about creating a mindful eating environment.
Hmm.
So what's one thing you can do to make your eating space a little more mindful? That's a good one. I think just minimizing distractions is huge. Like put your phone away, turn off the TV, maybe dim the lights. Anything that helps you focus on the food and the experience of eating.
Yeah, I love that. And just a reminder to everyone that this is an ongoing process. You're going to learn and adjust along the way. So be patient with yourself and keep experimenting until you find what works best for you.
Absolutely. And if you want even more guidance and support, definitely check out Dr. Franz's book. It's called Mindful Eating and Nutrition: Overcoming Emotional Eating. It's seriously packed with so much great info and inspiration. Well, this has been another awesome deep dive. Thanks for joining us, everybody, and we hope you learned some helpful tools for navigating emotional eating. Remember to be kind to yourselves, celebrate those wins, and keep experimenting. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.